There is a sketchbook that has no business existing. It was drawn by a man whose name appears in exactly 3 colonial survey records, none of which agree on his title, his rank, or whether he was even employed by the organization that sent him into the desert. His work was submitted in 1902. It was acknowledged, logged, and then quietly removed from the active cartographic archive by the following spring. The reason given was administrative redundancy. The actual reason was something else entirely. What he drew in that sketchbook, 61 pages of pencil and ink rendered under desert sun, showed a version of the Sahara that does not match any map produced before or after him. He recorded drainage channels that could not have formed in an arid climate. He recorded foundation lines buried under meters of sand that his survey instruments told him were perfectly geometric. He recorded the outlines of what his own field notes describe as civic infrastructure of substantial age and apparent regularity, stretching across regions that every official European survey had marked as uninhabited and without historical occupation. He submitted the sketchbook. Someone above him read it. And then, within 8 months, the entire cartographic framework for that region of North Africa was quietly reorganized under what archivists would later call the 1903 Saharan Survey Consolidation. His measurements were reclassified. His coordinates were absorbed into a new baseline. His name was moved to a footnote. What he saw is still in those 61 pages. And once you understand what he was looking at, the official story of the Sahara becomes very difficult to maintain. If this is the first time you are hearing about the Surveyor's sketchbook, it will not be the last. Subscribe and turn on notifications. What gets buried in a footnote has a way of resurfacing. His name was Henri Villard-Besson. That is the name used in the 1901 Survey Dispatch Register, kept by the French Institut Géographique, though a secondary ledger spells it Villard-Besson, and a third document, a supply requisition from the Algerian colonial administration, lists only H.V. Besson, with no first name at all. Whether this inconsistency was carelessness or something more deliberate is impossible to say now. What is clear is that in the spring of 1901, a man using some version of that name was dispatched into the Central Sahara with a survey kit, a camel team, and instructions to extend the existing cartographic baseline southward into territory that French colonial administrators had flagged as economically promising but geographically uncertain. The mission was not unusual. European powers were in the final phase of carving the African continent into administrative units, and that process required maps that could justify borders and give legal weight to territorial assertions made in European capitals by men who had never left those capitals. Survey teams were moving through the Sahara regularly. Most produced results that confirmed what the existing maps already suggested: vast, featureless, empty. Villard-Besson produced something different. The sketchbook surfaced in 2009 inches, a private estate sale in Lyon. The estate belonged to the family of a retired cartographic archivist who had spent his career at a regional branch of the Institut Géographique. It was listed in the sale catalogue as miscellaneous field materials, historical interest, unverified provenance. A researcher studying colonial-era survey disputes purchased it for the equivalent of €40. He later described opening it as one of the more disorienting experiences of his career. The first 20 pages are standard survey work, elevation profiles, bearing notations, sketches of rock formations used as triangulation landmarks. The handwriting is precise, and the draftsmanship competent without being remarkable. Margin notes on weather, water sources, the condition of the camel team. It reads exactly like what it is, the field record of a trained surveyor doing his job in difficult conditions. Then, on page 22, something changes. The entry begins mid-sentence, as though Villard-Besson had already been writing and decided to shift to the sketchbook for what came next. The sentence reads, "Cannot account for regularity of this kind through natural process, and must therefore record it as observed." What follows bears no resemblance to the standard survey notation on the preceding pages. He drew lines. Long, straight, parallel lines running beneath the surface of the sand, visible because the wind had scoured a section of the desert floor down to a compressed layer of sediment that showed color variation. The lines ran in 2 directions. They intersected at right angles. Their spacing was consistent across the entire exposed section, which he measured at approximately 240 meters in length. In the margin, spacing of interior lines suggests modular planning unit of approximately 4 meters. External boundary lines, heavier and deeper, appears intentional. He was describing the buried footprint of a city grid. The drawings are precise, the measurements are annotated. There is no ambiguity in what he recorded, only in what it means. The Tartaria thesis argues a global civilizational presence, technologically sophisticated, architecturally coherent, geographically widespread, that was destroyed or deliberately erased from the historical record sometime in the 18th or early 19th century. The evidence appears in places the conventional timeline cannot explain: mud flood architecture, buildings whose lower floors were buried not by gradual accumulation but by rapid sediment events. Maps from the 16th and 17th centuries showing Tartary as a vast, organized entity that simply vanishes from the cartographic record within a few generations. The Sahara sits at the center of this argument because the conventional account of the Sahara has always required a certain kind of selective attention. The Green Sahara period, lasting from roughly 9,000 to 5,000 years before the present, supported lakes, rivers, and populations of significant size. What the conventional account cannot satisfactorily explain is the speed of the transition, and more specifically, the absence of any civilization that should have been there at peak habitability, and the absence of any satisfying explanation for where that civilization went. Villard-Besson was not thinking about any of this. He was a surveyor. What he recorded because his training told him to record what he observed, regardless of whether it fit the expected framework. He had no reason to fabricate what he drew. He had no ideological position to defend. He was looking at something and drawing it as accurately as he could, and that professional instinct is exactly what makes the sketchbook so significant. By page 31, the drawings had expanded from grid lines to something larger. Moving his camp south, he encountered a depression in the terrain partially filled with wind-driven sand, in which the exposed edges of stone structures were visible. He described the stonework: blocks of uniform dimension, approximately 1 meter by half meter by half meter, fitted without visible mortar or binding agent, surfaces dressed to a tolerance I would estimate within 2 to 3 millimeters. Color consistent with local sandstone, but surface texture distinct smoother, as though the outer face has been treated or compressed in a manner I cannot determine by observation alone. He noted in the margin that the stonework's preservation implied either extreme aridity or a construction method, entirely outside his engineering education, and that he lacked the vocabulary to account for it properly. Dressed stone, fitted without mortar, 2 to 3 millimeter tolerance. This is not Bronze Age construction. This is not Roman construction, whose mortarless dry stone work does not achieve this precision at scale. The closest analogue in the conventional record would be certain sections of Egyptian temple construction whose precision has long been a source of legitimate academic controversy, but those temples have an established civilizational context that explains their existence. Villard-Besson was in the central Sahara, in a region the official maps marked as having no settlement history whatsoever. There was no civilization in the record that could have built what he was drawing, and the record is very careful to keep it that way. He spent 4 days there. The sketchbook shows it in detail: elevation sketches, cross-section diagrams, plan view drawings, attempting to capture the outline of what was exposed. Based on his subsurface readings, he estimated the footprint of the structure at roughly 300 meters on its longest axis. He wrote, "If the buried portion corresponds proportionally to what is exposed, this is a building of very substantial size. Condition: preserved to a degree inconsistent with the age I would assign it based on sediment depth." That phrase, preserved to a degree inconsistent with the age I would assign it based on sediment depth, is the one researchers return to. Standard geological reasoning holds that depth of overburden indicates age, and age means degradation. What he was looking at showed neither the degradation his instruments suggested, nor the archaeological record that should accompany a structure of this size in this region. It was preserved, and by every principle he had been trained on, it should not have been. He submitted his report in the late summer of 1902. The sketchbook and field notes were included as appendices. The report was received, logged, and assigned a reference number in the Institut Géographique's incoming materials register. A brief acknowledgement letter dated October of that year confirmed receipt and indicated the materials would be reviewed by the senior cartographic committee. There are no further communications in any accessible archive, no follow-up inquiry, no request for clarification, no record of the committee meeting at which his findings should have been discussed. The silence that follows is administrative in its texture, which is to say it is thorough and looks entirely unremarkable from the outside. The 1903 Saharan Survey consolidation reorganized the baseline coordinate system for the region, absorbed data from multiple field teams into a unified framework, and produced a revised set of official maps. Villard-Besson's coordinates appear in the documentation, but only as abstract numerical values. The descriptive content of his report, the anomalous structures, the grid lines, the dressed stone, does not appear. The sketchbook drawings are not referenced. His field notes are not cited. What was kept was his measurements. What was discarded was what those measurements pointed to. This is the 1903 pull. not a dramatic burning of records, a bureaucratic reorganization that absorbed the data and erased the interpretation. The numbers survived. The meaning they carried was classified as administratively redundant and allowed to disappear. The researcher who purchased the sketchbook spent 3 years attempting to locate the original report in the Institut Géographique archives. He was told records from that period had been transferred to a regional depository, partially damaged in a flood in the 1960s, and that surviving materials from the relevant reference number could not be positively identified. The sketchbook is the only surviving primary document from Villard-Besson's 1901 survey. On pages 53 through 58, he drew what he found at the bottom of a well shaft excavated near the final survey station. The shaft went down approximately 4 meters before hitting a layer of compacted material that resisted his tools. At the base, exposed in the wall of the excavation, was a section of pipe. He drew it carefully. Circular cross-section, approximately 15 centimeters in diameter, made of a material he described as a dark grey substance, unlike any natural mineral. I can identify consistent, non-granular, and apparently cast or formed rather than carved. The pipe ran horizontally through the wall in both directions, suggesting it was part of a larger system. No corrosion or degradation was visible on the exposed surface. The pipe was sealed at the exposed end by a fitted cap of the same material. He did not speculate about what it was for. He was a surveyor. He drew what he saw: cast material, no corrosion, fitted components, infrastructure beneath 4 meters of Saharan sand. The Tartarian framework argues that a civilization global in reach, sophisticated in technology, capable of infrastructure we have not yet recovered. The ability to replicate was present on this planet within the last several hundred years, and that the evidence of its presence has been systematically removed from the places where the official story is written and maintained, not always through dramatic suppression, often through something as mundane as an administrative consolidation, through a reclassification, through a flood in a regional depository, through an estate sale where 61 pages of the most anomalous survey record from the colonial Sahara are listed as miscellaneous field materials and sold for €40 to the one person paying attention. The sketchbook is real. The 1903 consolidation is real. The gap between what Villard-Besson submitted and what survived that consolidation is real. What you do with that gap depends entirely on what you are willing to consider. The sand covers a great deal. The question is not whether things are buried beneath it. The question is who decides which buried things get studied, which get excavated, and which get absorbed into a new baseline and allowed to mean nothing at all.